She was the largest and most luxurious ship of her time. Her opulent lounges and spacious cabins attracted both the wealthiest and humblest of passengers. She was the magnificent RMS Titanic, proclaimed as an unsinkable, technological wonder. But her majestic maiden voyage was overshadowed by an impending doom.
My mother had a premonition. From the very word go, she knew there was something to be afraid of.
On an eerie moonless night, just 4 days into her ocean crossing, with passengers lulled into a false sense of security, the splendid ship suddenly collided with a deadly iceberg.
Almost immediately came the most awful crash any mortal could imagine. It was horrible.
For 3 traumatic hours, the Titanic helplessly plunged into the frigid North Atlantic. Over 700 passengers escaping in lifeboats watched in horror as family and loved ones still clung onto the doomed vessel as she disappeared beneath the water.
The sound of people drowning are something that I cannot describe to you, and neither can anyone else. It's the most dreadful sound.
For the survivors of the legendary disaster, the fateful night of April 14th, 1912 would haunt them forever. She was called a floating palace, a ship of dreams. On April 10th, 1912, the luxury liner RMS Titanic embarked from Southampton, England for New York City. But no one imagined that her first voyage would be her last. 4 days into her transatlantic crossing, the opulent ship perished beneath the frigid water. She took with her over 1,500 souls. Now a sarcophagus of the sea, the legendary shipwreck still echoes the saga of the innocent people who lost their lives and the survivors who lived to tell the story.
I remember seeing it for every moment. And it's the most horrible thought in my mind to see that ship sink. I can see it. It's quite dreadful.
The ones who were left behind were the ones, of course, who would obviously panic. And they were the ones who were screaming and that it was on the Titanic.
Well, I have a very vivid memory of the night of the sinking. I remember like it was yesterday. Every time I see a photo of the Titanic, I have the impression of reliving this moment.
I will never forget the noise that Titanic made when it sank. Human beings screaming to get away from it. But they couldn't do it, too late.
That was a terrible, terrible time when I can still hear them jumping from the deck and screaming and yelling for help, and the boat finally went under the water. There was nothing left.
The Titanic disaster marked the end of an era. In one dramatic moment, nature shattered man's technological achievement. People began to question their belief and faith in the modern age.
To say that the ship was unsinkable, which indeed was what was claimed, to say a ship was unsinkable was flying in the face of God.
Americans at the beginning of the 20th century gauged progress in terms of technology. And if there's one emblem of the progress of technology, it is the Titanic, the largest moving object ever made by human beings to that point.
The RMS Titanic was built to be the superior liner of her time, the last word in luxury for passengers crossing the Atlantic. The driving force behind her extravagant construction was J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the British shipping company called the White Star Line. In the bustling Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, thousands of laborers built what was to be Bruce Ismay's ship of dreams. The Titanic was a skyscraper of a vessel. She spanned 4 city blocks, stood 11 stories high, and was stacked with 9 steel decks. Costing over $7 million, she was the largest man-made wonder of her time.
She was divided up into 16 watertight compartments, and it was to take 48 lifeboats altogether. But I guess the White Star Line just figured that since the Titanic probably was unsinkable, they would never need those extra lifeboats. And so they decided to go with what the Board of Trade had set down, which was any ship over 10,000 tons would carry 16 lifeboats.
The Titanic's 16 lifeboats, plus 4 collapsible boats, could hold less than half of the ship's 2,222 passengers and crew. But safety wasn't a concern for what was designed to be an unsinkable ship. More than safety, the Titanic symbolized the golden age of opulence. She featured a grand staircase lined with exquisite paintings, roomy sleeping quarters, and elegant dining lounges with gourmet menus fit for royalty. For exercise and relaxation, the Titanic offered wide promenade decks, a gymnasium, exotic Turkish baths, and one of the first indoor swimming pools on a passenger steamer. To capitalize on her spacious room, the romantic vessel attracted passengers from all walks of life, from the wealthiest of American and British society to poor European immigrants coming to America to start a new life.
The Titanic stuck very strongly to the class system of 1912, where you had the delineation between first, second, and third class. That first class was normally your very wealthy, second class was your middle American, your normal person, so to speak, and third class were your immigrants.
On April 10th, 1912, in Southampton, England, both rich and poor boarded the luxury liner for her maiden voyage to New York. Family and friends waved bon voyage to Titanic's passengers, never dreaming they wouldn't see most of them again. As the majestic ship sailed out to sea, the first-class passengers settled into their plush quarters. There were John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest passenger on the ship, traveling with his young pregnant wife, Madeline. American playboy Benjamin Guggenheim, whose family made their fortune in mining. Also aboard were Ida and Isidore Straus, who founded Macy's department store. And the tough-minded Colorado millionairess, Margaret Brown, who preferred being called Molly. Among the second-class passengers was 15-year-old Edith Brown. Her father was emigrating the family to Seattle, where he planned to make his fortune in the hotel business.
When we went up the staircase, it's really a beautiful staircase. She's really a beautiful boat. She had beautiful oil paintings up on the wall, and the tables were most beautifully laid with silver and white tablecloth. It was really a magnificent boat. You'll never see another one like her, never.
I do remember it being very beautiful and very big. My father was not along with us because he was in India. He had just worked for 6 years when my little brother became very sick. And the doctors in India told us that we would have to go to America right away or he would die.
The third-class passengers, also known as steerage, were housed in the lower decks of the ship. But their accommodations were just as spacious as those in second class on most other ships of her time.
We were traveling on the Titanic because we were immigrating to Kansas City, where my father hoped to open a tobacconist shop. We had a house already there waiting for us, and he thought it was absolutely wonderful going on the Titanic, and my mother too. Of course, all he could afford then was to go third class, because we were immigrating.
The commander of the Titanic's maiden voyage was Captain E.J. Smith, a 32-year veteran of the White Star liners. With retirement looming in the wings, this transatlantic crossing was ironically supposed to be his last.
Captain Smith was really the most popular captain on the ocean at the time and the highest paid of anyone. And so it was just natural that he would bring the Titanic over on its maiden voyage. And he'd had this very, very good career that was relatively accident-free, and I think that kind of gave him a complacency.
Captain Smith's jovial personality provided a sense of ease and comfort to the passengers. Bruce Ismay was also aboard to ensure his ship lived up to everyone's expectations. But some passengers were superstitious about taking this maiden voyage.
My mother had a premonition, and she never went to bed in that ship at night at all. She sat up every night. So she slept during the day, and I was with my father, and thinking how odd it was that my mother was never up during the day. But from the very word go, she knew there was something to be afraid of.
For the most part, Titanic passengers breathed in an air of optimism about the voyage and their future. They were under the spell that the ship was unsinkable.
They all had such high hopes, especially the immigrants, of making a new life in America, and were looking so much forward to it that, of course, everything went wrong.
Danger loomed over the luxury liner from almost the very first day. The Titanic received a stream of wired telegrams from other ships warning them of icebergs in the vicinity. Only 4 days into her maiden voyage, the Titanic would face her worst nightmare. On that fateful Sunday of April 14th, the sky was clear and the ocean was as smooth as glass. Titanic passengers enjoyed the day strolling the wide decks or taking in a game of shuffleboard.
They wouldn't have thought there would be any danger because the Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. And such a beautiful ship, they wouldn't even think of danger.
In the wireless room, operators Harold Bride and Jack Phillips were feverishly trying to catch up sending out passenger telegrams. They paid little attention to the incoming messages from other steamers reporting icebergs in the vicinity.
Captain Smith did what he could. He earlier in the day, being aware of some of these ice messages, he had ordered the Titanic be sailed about 10 miles farther south than she ordinarily would have been. He was thinking that she could go south around the ice field.
But the previous night, the wireless temporarily broke down. It was during that period of time that Captain Smith failed to receive a very critical message. The Titanic was steaming towards a massive ice field. At 9:20 p.m., Captain Smith left the bridge. He had instructed his officers to notify him of any danger. Most of the passengers had also retired to their cabins. Shortly before 11:40 p.m., the Crow's Nest lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted a black object up ahead.
The iceberg itself, of course, was difficult to see because there was no moon, no waves to wash upon it. And Fred kept peering into the darkness with his partner, Reginald Lee. And he said it looked like a bump on the horizon, a black bump, more or less.
Frederick Fleet rang the Crow's Nest bell and phoned down to the officers stationed on the bridge.
Iceberg, right ahead! Full speed astern! Hard for starboard!
First Officer William Murdoch ordered to turn the ship and put the engines in reverse. But it was too late. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic let out a crunching, thunderous roar as a deadly iceberg scraped along her starboard side.
We went to bed. In an hour and a half came the most awful crash that any mortal could imagine. It was horrible. Almost immediately, my father was at the door. Get on your warmest clothes and follow me.
My mother went out in the hall and asked the first cabin steward she saw, "What is the matter? Why have we stopped in the middle of the ocean?" And so he said, "No, there's nothing wrong at all. There's just had a little accident, and they're going to fix it, and we'll be going on in a few minutes."
First Officer Murdoch ordered to close the watertight doors, but green seawater was already gushing into the bowels of the ship.
Down in boiler room number 5, Fred Barrett, a leading stoker, said it sounded like a big gun going off, and he said the entire side of the ship seemed to cave in. Water came bursting through the side of the ship and swept him almost off his feet.
The iceberg ripped through the Titanic's hull, rupturing 6 of her watertight compartments. This was more than the designers of the ship had ever anticipated.
This was a damage of 300 feet long, and of course, much more damage that the ship would sustain. And like an ice cube tray, one compartment fills up, spills over into another and another until the whole thing is filled up. It was just plain common sense that the ship was going to sink.
Moments after the collision, Captain Smith rushed to the bridge. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, also felt the ship shudder. He too came up to see what had happened. Captain Smith asked Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, to assess the damage. Andrews replied the Titanic had less than 2 hours to live. Captain Smith was faced with a seaman's worst nightmare. His ship was sinking, and he knew there were only enough lifeboats to save less than half of Titanic's passengers. The captain gave his crew the grim orders to uncover the lifeboats.
It has to be hard for any captain to make that decision that you've got these what are conceivably little lifeboats, even though they're, big enough to hold 65 people, and you have to put your passengers in them and put them out into the middle of the ocean, almost to fend for themselves.
Word of the disaster spread slowly across the ship. Without the aid of a whistle or alarm system, the crew was dispatched to all 3 classes. They pounded on cabin doors, waking passengers and ordering them up to the deck with their life belts on.
You had a number of cases where people didn't know why they were getting into lifeboats, and they didn't appreciate that the ship was sinking. Some of them even thought, well, maybe they're just trying to make the ship a little lighter by putting the people off in lifeboats, that they'll all be back by breakfast.
Captain Smith instructed his officers to load women and children first into the lifeboats, but many wives were reluctant to obey orders.
It actually was an extremely scary and brave thing for the first women to get into the lifeboats on the open sea in the middle of the night in freezing temperatures, especially since they, like their husbands, thought that the Titanic was unsinkable.
All I know is that my father went on deck to see what had happened and said apparently the ship is an iceberg and you'd better get the children out of bed and up on deck. And so that's what they did. And apparently, because we were third-class passengers, and a lot of them weren't allowed up, I think because my mother had a small baby and a smaller child, we were allowed on and were able to get into a lifeboat, number 13. And my father said, well, I hope to come on soon after. And I was put over in a sack. And my brother, my mother wasn't able to find him, but she couldn't do anything about it.
At 12:15 in the morning, the wireless operators began sending out frantic distress signals. But most ships in the area were still too far away to rescue the Titanic in time.
The passengers wouldn't have known there weren't enough lifeboats on the Titanic. It wouldn't have entered their head.
At 12:45, Titanic officers spotted a dim light coming from a mysterious ship in the distance. 4th Officer Joseph Boxall began firing distress rockets. Was the dim light in the distance coming from the steamship Californian? That night, she was approximately 19 miles away from the Titanic. Aboard the Californian, the crew observed the rockets. Unaware that the ship was the Titanic, they signaled back with a Morse lamp. But the Titanic didn't respond. So Captain Stanley Lord, commander of the Californian, assumed the ship was not in any danger. The Titanic continued to shower the sky with rockets. But the mysterious light in the distance, whether it was from the Californian or another vessel out at sea, eventually disappeared. And with it went the passengers' last glimmer of hope.
My father said, "Now stand right by this lifeboat and don't let anyone move you." My father put my mother and I in and made absolutely no attempt to get in himself. And it wasn't until we were in the lifeboat and rowing away as far as we could, it wasn't until then that I realized that ship was going to sink.
This tragedy didn't happen in 10 minutes or 20 minutes. It was sort of like a play unfolding, where people were slowly becoming aware over this extended period of time that something serious had happened, and the urgency became greater and greater as time went on.
The Titanic's orchestra brought their instruments on deck and began performing ragtime tunes to lull the panicked passengers loading into the lifeboats. But those passengers deep inside the Titanic heard a not-so-soothing sound. Ocean water began creeping up the lower decks and climbing the stairwells. The unsinkable ship was sinking deeper and deeper.
There were passengers in each class who did remain asleep. There was one lady in third class, a Finnish lady, who said afterwards her husband went out on deck to find out what happened, and he never came back. And she went back to sleep, and she finally woke up, and the room was really tilting at a serious angle, and she worked her way up to the boat deck and got into a boat and got away, and she never saw him again.
One of the problems that the third class had, first of all, was the language problem. When stewards would go down and knock on the doors of all the immigrants, people really didn't quite understand what was going on, coupled with the fact that the passageways up to where the lifeboats were not convenient.
The Goldsmiths were one of the more fortunate third-class passengers. The English-born couple, along with their 9-year-old son Frankie, escaped through a maze of passageways up to the lifeboat deck.
Frank Goldsmith felt something, and the throbbing of the ship stopped, and he was down in third class, and he went up on deck, and he could see that there was a problem. And while he was up there, the doctor came down and got the Goldsmith family up and asked them to put their life belts on and go up on deck.
There was so much noise upstairs. They were running upstairs and running in the halls and yelling and all that. We put our coats over our night clothes. We put our shoes and stockings on. We did not put on any life belts. And came to this great big room, and it was full of women, and in all kinds of dress and undress. They were crying or they were scared because they didn't know what was going to happen. We were there for about 5 minutes. My mother came to me and she says, "Well, Ruth, it's so cold outside." She said, "Would you please go down and get 3 blankets from our cabin to wrap around?" My little brother was 2 and my sister was 4.
When Ruth Becker returned with the blankets, she discovered her family was ordered to be lowered down in a lifeboat without her. Ruth's mother yelled up to her to get into the next boat.
So I did just that. I wasn't a bit scared. I was very excited. It never dawned on me that we might drown or anything like that. But anyway, I said, "May I get into this boat?" He says, "Why, sure," and he picked me up and threw me in.
Second-class passenger Michel Navratil, who was estranged from his wife in France, had kidnapped his 2 sons. He intended to steal them away aboard the Titanic to America to start a new life. But sometime after the ship struck the iceberg, he carried his sons to the lifeboat deck.
J'ai eu une impression d'angoisse.
I had such a feeling of anxiety, probably because I was separated from my mother and was with my father and my brother. I could not understand that the Titanic was going to sink. My father put me in a lifeboat. I remember the moment when the lifeboat was lowered, and the noise in the water, and the splashes in the water.
Du bruit qu'il a fait dans l'eau, du gouffre qu'il a fait dans l'eau.
Countless passengers displayed acts of bravery and courage during the last hour the Titanic remained afloat.
I've read dozens of accounts where the women had the opportunity to save themselves, but they wouldn't do it. Mrs. Strauss was offered a chance to get into a lifeboat. Her husband wouldn't leave the ship. He wanted to give the women and children a chance. And Mrs. Strauss just refused to leave. She says, if you're staying here, I'm going to stay with you no matter what.
Among the brave men, first-class passenger John Jacob Astor escorted his wife Madeline into a lifeboat and then quietly walked away. American millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet eventually took off their life belts and changed into their finest evening attire. He told a steward to send his wife this message: "We dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen."
I think the men did know they may not live. And one of the examples was Frank Goldsmith said to his young son, "So long, Frankie, I'll see you later." Frank assumed his father was going to follow him, but he didn't.
Many of the first lifeboats lowered were half full because the officers feared they would collapse before they hit the ocean. But as the ship sank deeper and deeper, they filled the boats to full capacity.
On the starboard side of the Titanic, as it was sinking, First Officer Murdoch was allowing men in if there was room in the boat. And you had instances where men pretty much were ordered into boats. It was like, get in, we need to fill this lifeboat sort of thing.
But as fewer and fewer lifeboats remained on deck, panic ensued. Some men made a desperate dash towards the last few lifeboats.
My father took my mother and I to our boat number 14. But as the boat was going down, lowering it, somebody jumped into it, a man. And the officer said, "I could mind to shoot you." He says, "You could have upset the boat with women and children in it."
There was another steerage passenger named Daniel Buckley who jumped into lifeboat number 4 and crouched down in the bottom of the boat. And he said that a woman got a scarf, took off a scarf and put it over his head, and apparently made him look enough like a woman that the officers overlooked him, and he was able to stay in the boat that way.
There were boys who really were barely into their teens and by right should have been able to go. They were certainly not filling the lifeboats, and they were denied access because they were just a little too old. They just were young men rather than boys. And Mrs. Lucille Carter happened to be standing nearby with her 12-year-old son, and she took off her straw hat and slammed it down on his head and said, "There now, my boy can go. He's a girl."
Up until 2 a.m., the beleaguered Bruce Ismay had helped women and children into the lifeboats. But just moments before collapsible boat C was being lowered, he decided to save his own life and hopped in. Shortly after 2 a.m., the last collapsible boat was lowered down to the icy water. Some passengers rowing away thought they heard the orchestra play the gentle hymn, "Mirror My God to Thee." But the soothing music soon stopped when the ship's stern began to rise up from the water like a giant beast.
Once those few boats were gone, you can imagine the panic of 1,500 people left behind. Or you can't imagine, nobody can imagine.
In 15 minutes, the Titanic would sink. For the 1,500 souls still aboard the doomed vessel, the nightmare was just beginning. At 10 minutes past 2 a.m., the Titanic's stern continued to rise up from the water. The ship was ready to plunge at any moment. A weary Captain Smith entered the wireless room to release the operators from their duty. He told them it was every man for himself.
The last 15 minutes, the ship really began to sink. People said they could feel the ship sinking beneath their feet. The stern began to rise up out of the water. There was just an incredible amount of noise coming from within side of it. You had everything that was loose falling, and of course you had the furniture and such. You had people falling, and you also had the noise of the ship breaking apart.
The Titanic was going down very slowly, and these people were standing there at the decks, at the railing, wishing somebody, I suppose, would come and rescue them. But finally it did go down, and all the people who were standing at the decks, at the railing, jumped. They jumped and they screamed and they yelled and for help. And of course nobody came to help.
I'll never forget the terrible noise that ship made when it was drawn down. Human beings screaming and the rush of water. It was terrible.
At 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, the Titanic's stern disappeared beneath the water. For a moment, there was a chilling silence. Then the sound of desperate voices echoed above the ocean's surface.
I think most of the people who were on the ship actually managed to get off into the water. Either they jumped just before the ship went down or they were washed off the ship as she plunged. The majority of the 1,500 that were lost were actually floating on the surface after the ship was gone.
We rowed away just as fast as we could because these people were screaming and yelling, and they wanted to get into our boat. We had about 65 or 70 in our boat. We couldn't take any more.
Most passengers in the lifeboats were unwilling to go back to save those hopelessly swimming in the below freezing water. But in lifeboat number 14, 5th Officer Harold Lowe rescued 3 near-dead souls.
Officer Lowe would row towards a cry in the distance that they would hear, but before they would reach the person, the cry would stop, and they had no way to know where the person was, and they would hear another cry off in another direction.
The sounds of people drowning are something that I cannot describe to you, and neither can anyone else. It's the most dreadful sound, and there's a terrible silence that follows it. When the ship was no longer there, and the lights had all gone, and dark night was round us, I remember thinking that everything in the world was standing still.
45 minutes after the Titanic had vanished, the moans, shrieks, and cries for help stopped. A haunting silence filled the frigid air.
They were probably too frightened to sort of speak or do anything. They were wondering what on earth was going to happen next. The people in the lifeboats on the Titanic were there for some hours before they were picked up. And it was so bitterly cold.
In most of the lifeboats, a crew member or a male passenger was in charge. But in lifeboat number 6, Colorado millionairess Molly Brown took over the tiller.
As they said back in Colorado, Molly Brown had a heart as big as a ham. She really was a wonderful woman, I think, in her own right, even if she was somewhat eccentric. Once they got away from the ship, they had this quartermaster at the tiller who just didn't want to do this and didn't want to do that, and he was hogging all the blankets, she claimed, and so she finally got the women to row. She sort of organized them, and eventually Molly Brown took charge of the lifeboat. I considered it sort of bravery on their part that you had people like Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Thayer and some of the more prominent millionairesses, grabbing an oar, but really it was necessity.
We rowed and rowed and rowed from 1 o'clock to 4:30 in the morning. And in the distance, way in the distance, finally, we saw this great big light. And then we saw rockets going up. We just yelled, screamed, we were so happy. So we rowed and rowed and rowed to this light. And it was the Carpathia.
The ocean liner Carpathia under the command of Captain Arthur Rostrom, had been steaming towards the Titanic ever since she received her distress signals the night before. At 4 o'clock on Monday morning, the Carpathia rescued Titanic's 705 surviving passengers.
As we went on the Carpathia, one of the passengers from the Titanic was waiting there with my brother. And my mother, of course, saw my brother. And so then was, of course, very, very relieved.
We had blankets piled to the ceiling and food, brandy and hot coffee. And a lady came up to me and she says, "Is your name Ruth Becker?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "Well, your mother has been looking every place for you." So I was reunited with my mother and my brother and my sister, and they were all right.
Once all the survivors were safely aboard, the Carpathia steamed back to the scene of the disaster one last time to see if any passengers were still alive in the water. The crew saw only one floating body.
When the Carpathia saved us, the women were all standing at the rail watching for their husbands to come in later boats, and they never came.
The Carpathia, now a ship of widows, reversed her course and headed for New York City. For the Titanic's surviving passengers, the drama was far from over. News of the Titanic disaster sent shockwaves across America and Europe. In New York City, frantic families and friends lined up in front of the White Star Line offices. They demanded to know if their loved ones were alive. On April 18th, the nation's questions were answered. The Carpathia sailed into New York's harbor. Over 40,000 people lined the Battery in Lower Manhattan to get a glimpse of the survivors.
People came out to watch the Carpathia arrive, and a lot of them had been chartered by newspapers, and they had all these reporters on board, and they were just screaming questions up to the Carpathia. And, you know, they'd see somebody out on deck, and they'd start screaming at them, "Are you a survivor? What happened? What happened? You know, jump overboard. We'll catch you."
Nobody was allowed to get off the ship unless they had friends, good friends, or relatives in New York meeting them there. My father was in India, and a very good friend of ours cabled my father and said, "All Beckers saved." Well, my father didn't know what we were saved from, but he figured we were saved from a train wreck.
The homecoming was bittersweet for most of the survivors. Some had lost their entire family at sea. The return was particularly devastating for third-class women, many of whom were immigrants in a strange land, penniless and without their husbands. Melvina Dean's family eventually returned to England.
We had lost everything. We did have relations in Kansas City, but we had lost absolutely everything. We had no money, we had no clothes, we had nothing at all. That my mother thought it much better to come on home.
Like Melvina Dean, many children who survived the Titanic disaster faced a future without a father, and life haunted by the memories of that fatal night. Lolo and Momon Navratil became known as the orphans of the Titanic. Their father, Michel, who had kidnapped them from their mother, perished with the ship. 3 weeks after the disaster, their mother, Marcel, read about the orphan boys in a French newspaper. She realized they were her sons.
Je me souviens du moment.
I remember the moment my father put me in the lifeboat.
Dans le canot. Et à ce moment-là, il m'a
At that moment, he told me to give all of his affection to my mother.
toute son affection à ma mère. C'est ce que
That is what I relayed to her later, when I was reunited with her.
revu.
With so many lives lost, the United States and Great Britain opened inquiries to find someone to blame. Captain Smith, who didn't survive the disaster, was cleared of any wrongdoing. So was the White Star managing director, Bruce Ismay, although the press and public vilified him for saving his own life while so many women and children had died. But Captain Stanley Lord, commander of the Californian, was harshly criticized for not coming to the aid of the Titanic when seeing her distress rockets.
I don't think any one person can be blamed for the Titanic disaster and the number of lives that were lost. There were so many different factors that entered into it. But the ultimate cause of the loss of life that took place was the regulation about the lifeboats.
It will go into history as the one disaster for which there was no excuse for anyone to die. If the Titanic had had enough lifeboats, nobody would have died, because there was plenty of time to save everyone.
The 705 lives saved, compared to the 1,522 lives lost, was staggering. The public was outraged that more first-class men were rescued than third-class children.
Lots of male survivors of the Titanic disaster really carried a stigma. Somehow it just was not right if you were a man and you survived this disaster.
Funeral services and eulogies for those perished at sea spread across 2 continents. And so too did the myths and legends about the once luxurious ocean liner. How could she disappear beneath the sea forever? For decades, underwater exploration to find the Titanic became an obsession, a search for a legacy. Almost 75 years after the legendary shipwreck, the quest would be fulfilled. And for the survivors, the memories would resurface once again. In September of 1985, a team of scientists, led by American oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, finally discovered the hauntingly beautiful ship that had vanished 74 years earlier. The expedition to the Titanic finally solved the mystery as to what really happened to the once majestic ship. Scientists now know that minutes before she sank, the Titanic split in 2. The bow plunged quickly. The stern remained afloat for a few moments before disappearing beneath the water. Both sections sank to the ocean floor and landed 1/3 of a mile apart from each other.
We heard of the terrible trauma that the Titanic received, and that the people who were on the stern of the Titanic had the worst end of it because she imploded.
Well, it didn't even enter my head that anybody would look for it. And so complete amazement and, not horror exactly, but I wasn't really awfully pleased, I must admit, because I thought that my father was still on there.
Since her discovery, scientists have salvaged artifacts and personal belongings from the debris field located between the Titanic's bow and stern. There have even been attempts to raise part of the Titanic's hull.
I hope severely that they will never attempt to raise part of it, but I have an enormous admiration for the scientific skill in finding it. It astounded me with wonderment.
I don't mind the underwater explanation of the Titanic, but I don't think they should raise the Titanic. I think that would be entirely wrong. I think it should stay where it is, at the bottom of the sea, as a grave.
The Titanic always fascinates us because it was not a victim of the weather, it was not a victim of war. The Titanic seems to be a romantic disaster that has all the Greek legends within it. You have the clear night, you have a calm sea, you have people dressed up in their finest, who were the cream of society, and your second class and third class, it's all right there.
The Titanic disaster has left a legacy of the human condition. A legacy of loyalty, bravery, self-sacrifice, and human weakness. There is a legacy of the innocent victims lost at sea and those who survived to preserve their memory.